Hello and welcome to Jason's Macintosh Museum. I'm Jason, your host, and what we're looking at today is a Macintosh Classic II from 1991. Now, I'm sure a lot of you who are familiar with these compact Macintoshes remember the Classic II, especially if you worked in an educational environment or if you used them at school, because these were purchased in huge numbers, mainly for the educational markets. And in many ways, it's a logical extension of the original Macintosh Classic that came out in 1990, in that it still has the same design, it still has the black and white built-in screen, still has the same form factor, but several improvements were made over the original Classic to improve its performance. So, a little bit of background. The Classic II was launched in October of 1991 and was discontinued in September of 1993. And this particular model, in fact, dates from November of 1991, so it's one of the early build models. And in terms of the specifications, very similar, in fact, to the Color Classic, which I looked at in one of my previous videos, in that it has a 16 MHz Motorola 68030 CPU, albeit with a 16-bit data bus, which does impact on performance. It comes as standard with 4 MB of memory, which is expandable up to 10 MB with 30-pin SIMs. And like all of the compact Macintosh models, apart from the Color Classic, of course, it has the standard 9-inch black and white screen with a resolution of 512 by 384 pixels. So at this point, let's have a closer look at the Color Classic II. Here's the front view of the Macintosh Classic II, and notice that although it is still a compact Macintosh model, the styling was updated in 1990 when the Classic was launched to create a more modern look as compared with the older models. And in fact, if you compare this to an older model, such as this Macintosh SE that I have here, you can see that the Classic II certainly looks a lot more modern. They've done away with all the horizontal slots on the front panel. The hard disk, internal hard disk, now does not have an indicator light or a blanking plate, and the front panel also has a slight curve to it, whereas the older machines, such as the SE, had a completely flat front panel. So, interesting to compare the two. We'll just get this out of here. So what do we have? Well, first of all, we have the display, which is a standard 9-inch CRT, although this CRT is a little different from the ones that the ones that were used on older Macintosh models, such as the SE, the Plus, and the SE30. The screen is less curved and also is, I believe, probably not quite as sharp as the older screens, in fact, although having said that, it's still a very, very clear screen, although it is still monochrome and still has a resolution of 512 by 384 pixels. Going down from there, we have the floppy drive, which is a standard 1.4 megabyte SuperDrive, which was fitted to all Macintosh models at this time, which can read and write both the 1.4 megabyte Macintosh and PC format discs, along with the older 800 and 400K Macintosh format discs. And then across from there we have the Apple logo and the Macintosh Classic II nameplate. And note that on these models it's on the left-hand side rather than the SE and the... In fact, I think the SE was on the right-hand side, the Classic II was on the left-hand side. It's just how they chose to do it. But that's about it for the front panel. And notice as well that you focus. Thank you. Notice that there is no brightness control on the front panel. Normally, on older models of Macintosh, such as the SE, the Plus and the SE30, it would sit down here underneath the Apple logo. Now, the reason you don't have one on the Classic II is because the Classic II, along with the Classic, were the first models of compact Macintosh to support software-controlled screen brightness. Although, unlike the later Color Classic, there was no front panel adjustment for the brightness. It all had to be done through the control panel. So that's about it for the front. So we'll look at the side. And it's easier just to do this, I think. There we go. That's the side. Now, there's really not much to talk about, apart from the reset and interrupt switches down here, which are now standard, were standard on the Classic II. Prior models did not have them as standard. The logic board did have the required switches, but you had to clip an external switch onto the casing in order to use them. But on this model, they are now standard. So that's the side, and now we'll have a look at the back. There. So here is the back view of the Color Classic II. It's not a Color Classic, it's a Classic. Actually, I don't have a Color Classic II. I'm trying to find one of those, but they're very, very rare. But anyhow, the Classic II. So at the top, like any compact Macintosh, we have the screws, we have the carry handle up here, and we have the screws, two of the screws you need to take out to remove the back panel. And interesting point over here, this is where a label was once placed on this unit. I'm not sure what it was. It could have been an asset tag or a service sticker or something like that, but notice how much the casing has yellowed, how much it's changed in colour, as compared to the area of the case where the label was covering it. And this is actually a common problem with plastics that were used in old computers around this time. And I'm sure some of you will let me know about this, but I'm already aware that there is a special chemical called Retrobrite, which you can use to help reverse this yellowing and bring the plastic back to its original colour. But technically, this is that's the colour that the Classic II was when it was new, but it's gone a little bit yellow since then. So on this side, this is where on older Macintosh models, this is where you would normally find the CMOS clock battery. But on the Classic II and the Classic, it's actually where extra display adjustment controls are housed. And I think I can show you that. I think if we pop this panel off, if I put a screwdriver in there and pop this panel off, oh, there we go. That worked. You can see that behind the panel we have various other controls, but strangely enough, they're actually unmarked. So without referring to the service manual, you don't actually know what they do, but I believe that one of them, I think, is for the screen cutoff control. Another one's for probably the horizontal or vertical size or centering. But anyhow, if you have the service manual, you can make those adjustments. And then below that we have the power switch and the power inlet. Now, like previous models of Macintosh, the Classic II did not support soft power. So you basically had to turn it on with this power switch and turn it off with this power switch. So the power key on the keyboard wouldn't do anything. Although, having said that, if you were running the Classic II and then hit the power key on the keyboard, the OS would prompt you whether you wanted to shut down or restart, but you couldn't use the power key on the keyboard to turn the system on. We have the fan grill over here, although the fan isn't located behind here. It's actually located in the bottom of the case, but this is where the hot air is blown out from. We have the manufacturing date and serial number tag here, so it was manufactured November 1991, which, as I said, makes it a very early build Classic II, because it was only released in October of 1991. Here we have the various information: Macintosh Classic II, made in Singapore, model number, and all of the various all the various certifications or what have you. Security lock, cable point over here. Not much else around here. And then we have all the ports at the bottom. So from left to right, we have the audio input port, because the Classic II did support sound recording, although there was no built-in microphone. One ADB port, an external floppy port, and if I remember correctly, the Classic II was in fact the very last model of Macintosh to have an external floppy port, because the Color Classic did not, and I don't believe any of the newer modular models of Macintosh had one either, so that's interesting to note. We have the external SCSI port here, printer and modem ports, and sound output. Then we have the other two screws you need to take out to remove the back panel. So, unfortunately, unlike the Color Classic, you have to remove the entire back panel off the Classic II in order to take the logic board out. So that's what we'll do. I'll remove those 4 screws and we'll take the back panel off and we'll have a look inside. Okay, well, I've removed the back panel off the Classic II, so we can now have a look inside. So obviously we have the CRT up here and all of the various components that go along with it. The hard drive, which is a 40 megabyte on this unit, sits here, although it's actually mounted upside down. Strange enough, I'm not quite sure why that is, but that's how they chose to do it. The floppy drive sits underneath that, here. And then on this side we have the analog board and power supply board. And note in fact that compared to, say, the SE or the SE30, the analog board is actually much smaller than it used to be. You can see that in fact it's only about 2/3 of the height of the case, whereas in older models the analog board took up the entire side area of the case. And I've found as well that these analog boards tend to be a bit more robust than the older analog boards that we used in the SE and Plus series. So, moving on from there, we have the logic board down at the bottom here. So, to remove the logic board out of the Classic II, you have to first disconnect the various connectors that are actually on the board, and looking at that, if we tip it up, you can see that we have the floppy drive connector here, we have the hard disk connector here. Oop, that didn't, I probably shouldn't be doing that. I'm probably going to get you a different view on that. Be right back. Okay, so now I've got a different view. I'm actually holding the camera here. So you can see that we have the connectors down here. So we have the floppy drive connector here. We have the connector for the hard disk here, and we also have, if we can look, let's take these out first actually, and we'll go from there. So unplug that. Unplug that. There we are. I'll just unplug this as well off the hard disk to get it out of the way. Okay, and now you can see that we also have the connect. Oh, let me just get that out of the way there. Okay, all good. Now we have the connector for the logic board here. So this is the connector that feeds both the power to the logic board and also all the various other signals for the CRT. So you just have to unplug that, but just by pushing down on the tab and carefully moving it out of the way, like that. And once you do that, you should be able to slide the logic board out. And there it is. So now we have the logic board out, we'll take a closer look at this. I've quickly tipped the Classic II onto its front panel to illustrate where the fan is located in this model. Because even though there is a fan grill on the back of the unit, that is not where the fan is situated. It's actually located right here. So it sits in there and it draws air through this grill here from the bottom of the machine, and then it eventually finds its way out through the ventilation slots on the back. But what I've noticed is that in some Classic IIs that I've looked at, this grill can be completely clogged with dust and dirt, which prevents the fan from working as effectively as it could. So if you ever have one of these and you're opening it up, make sure that you clean this grill out. Here is the logic board from the Color Classic. Why do I keep saying Color Classic? From the Classic II. And note that, in fact, it's in a sense very similar to the Color Classic in that the actual size of the logic board is greatly reduced over older models of Macintosh. In fact, I have one here we can use for comparison. I have here a logic board from the original Macintosh from 1984, and if we sit them alongside each other, well, this could be a little tricky. Zoom out there. You can see the difference. Basically, the logic board for the Classic II is about half the size and probably has about half the number of components, despite the fact that it's a far more powerful system. Of course, the logic board on the left is from the original Macintosh, which had an 8 MHz 68000 and 128 kilobytes of memory as standard, whereas this board, of course, is from the Classic II, which has a 16 MHz Motorola 68030 and 4 megabytes of memory as standard. So you can see that there have been, in the 10 or so years, or in fact closer to the 8 or so years since these two machines were built, there have been quite a few improvements. Anyway, we'll take that out of here. Put you there. So, back to this. So let's have a closer look at what we've got. So, starting from the bottom, I've seen this on a few logic boards where we have what looks like an edge connector down at the bottom here. Now this is in fact not used for when the machine is actually assembled, so I believe it was probably used during the testing and manufacturing of the board itself. Above that we have the two 30-pin, the camera's on a bit of a, let me see if I can fix that. I just need to quickly adjust the camera there, it's looking a little bit lopsided. That's a little bit better. There we go. Oh, this tripod is a little bit difficult to control. Okay, well we have the two 30-pin SIM slots that you can use for memory expansion on the Classic II. Moving over from there, we have some other support chips. We have the ROM chips here, and it brings me to an interesting point that there are several revisions of the Classic II motherboard or logic board, and I've got another one here I can show you in a moment, that has 4 ROM chips rather than 2. I'm not sure why that was done. It was probably a way for them to use higher density, higher capacity ROM chips later in production. And then we have some jumpers down here, which in fact are obviously used to specify the type of ROM chips that are on the board. So I'm not quite sure whether they would ever be used. All the Classic IIs that I've seen have all these jumpers open. Moving up from there, we have an expansion slot here, which is labelled as a ROM/FPU expansion slot, mainly because this is not a memory expansion slot as it was on the Classic. This is, I believe, only to be used for adding a 68882 FPU, or possibly adding a different type of ROM. I don't know, there may have been accelerator cards made for the Classic II, but I'm certainly not aware of any. The main CPU is here, a Motorola 68030 running at 16 MHz, but of course running on a 16-bit data bus, which does impact on performance. The CMOS or PRAM battery would go here, a 3.6 volt lithium, which I always remove, of course, because they can corrode over time. the main connector for the power and monitor signal out here, clock crystal here, glue logic chips here, there's the onboard memory. Moving up from there we have the reset and interrupt switches here. That I believe is the sound chip, focus, the sound chip there. Or actually they could be the sound chips, I'm not quite sure. They're probably the serial, the RS422 controllers for the printer and modem ports. That I believe is the SCSI controller there. That, I'm not sure, it could be the floppy controller, not quite sure about that. We have the floppy connector here. We have well, sometimes it's called the CUDA chip here, which controls the real-time clock, and I think also the keyboard and mouse interfaces. The ADB, I'm not quite sure about that in fact, but, and then we have the various ports up here. So there's not much to really talk about on the logic board. It's very well integrated when compared with older Macintosh models. But as I said, I did notice that there were a couple of different revisions of this board. And in fact, I have one of them here that I'll put alongside just to illustrate the differences. Now, I believe that this board on the left was pulled out of, I think it was a later model Classic II, I'm not quite sure. But the main difference is the ROM chips. As you can see, we now have 4 of them rather than 2. But everything else on the board looks to be more or less the same. And the boards are in fact interchangeable between the Classic II models. Functionally, they're exactly the same. So, that's a look at the logic board of the Macintosh Classic II. So in the next part of this video series, we will start the Classic II up and we'll try some software. So stay tuned and thank you for watching.